You can group users into or place users in groups for administrative reasons. It's easier to manage groups rather than manage individual users. A lot of times users have common permissions and common features that you'll need across large groups of users, so that's where groups come in handy. There are different types of groups. So there are security groups and distribution groups. The distribution group is used to group users together mainly for Microsoft Exchange. If you're integrating your Active Directory with Exchange, and if you're not using Exchange, then distribution groups may not be terribly useful for you. But that's the first type. But security groups are more common. We'll always use security groups with Active Directory. So groups can have objects as members. They can be within a group. You can have user accounts, contacts, distribution groups, security groups, and computers. The primary two that we'll talk about in this section of the course are going to be user accounts and computers, which can be members of groups. So security groups are the way that Active Directory administrators manage network resources and access and grant rights to users. Typically, we don't do that at the user level. It's too granular at the user level. So typically, we do this at the group level. So they can contain some types of objects, such as distribution groups, which I just talked about, or contacts and so forth. But mostly we use this for security, for creating permissions. So converting a group type. So group type can be changed from a security to a distribution and vice versa, but only security groups can be added to a discretionary access control list. In other words, if you're going to use discretionary access control lists, then it has to be a security group. That doesn't work with a distribution group. You won't have those options in a distribution group. It has no context with discretionary access control. So if a security group is converted to a distribution group, the entry will remain in the DACL, but it has no effect on the resource. So you don't lose those settings, but it simply has no effect if you make it a distribution group. So certainly if you convert it back to a security group, then the DACL will have an effect. So there are three different scopes that we talk about in this course. There's domain local, global, and universal groups. And there's also a fourth group called local, which only applies to the SAM database. If you recall, the SAM database is the local computer. So it's not stored in the domain. So the three main ones that we worry about as a domain administrator are going to be domain local, global, and universal. So this is just a brief explanation. This is from your textbook, so this is a good chart to look at in your textbook and understand the difference between domain local, global, and universal. And I'll talk about them just briefly here, but really what this comes down to is the granularity, or the sort of the hierarchical structure of how you organize users. And along with that is when you create discretionary access control lists to groups, it's important to understand what type of group it is to understand how those permissions are going to get to apply to groups, to understand that hierarchical structure. And Microsoft has these various acronyms that you have to memorize. And if you're going to sit for any of these tests or the certifications for Microsoft Windows Server, you want to make sure you memorize these. But the first one is AGDLP, which is accounts are made up of global groups, accounts are made members of global groups, which are members of domain local groups, which are assigned permissions to resources. So accounts are members of global groups, which are members of domain local groups. And a lot of people get that confused because they think it should be the other way around, that an account should be in a domain local and domain local should be a member of a global, but it's actually AGDLP. So it's important to remember that. And then going to the next level, accounts can be members of global groups, and when necessary, nested in other global groups, which are made members of universal groups, which are then made members of domain local groups, which are assigned permissions. And that is how the permissions are assigned. So a global group is used mainly to group users from some domain with similar access or rights requirements. So if you have basically a group of users or accounts or computers that are going to have the same types of rights, then you would put them in the same global group. So a common use is creating a global group for each department, location, et cetera, et cetera. And in a single domain environment, global groups are added to domain local groups for assigning resource permissions. So a universal group is can basically contain users of any domain in the forest and can be assigned permissions to resources in any domain in the forest. So the difference here is a domain local and a global group are within a domain, but a universal group applies to the entire forest. So you can basically create a group at the forest level, which is a universal group, and then within the domain you can have your domain local and your global groups, which we talked about just a few seconds ago. So universal group membership caching is a feature that allows you to keep a local copy of universal group members after querying a global catalog server. In other words, if you're on one domain and you need information about universal groups which may permeate through other domains in the forest, you might want to cache that information, and that's what they're talking about here. Um, and one of the things that's also mentioned in the textbook is making sure that you plan your Active Directory group design so that universal groups do not, you don't have to make changes to universal groups very often. They should be very static, those settings in the universal groups. So that would be something at a very high level that doesn't have to be constantly managed, so you don't have to recache that information, which may take some time to permeate throughout the enterprise. A local group is created in the local SAM database, which I talked about before. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's important to know that the local groups exist because users can also be placed inside local groups on a local computer, which can get a little bit too granular and can sometimes cause some administrative issues. But what's even more confusing is nesting groups, where you can have not only can groups can groups contain users, but they can also contain other groups. So you can nest groups within other groups. And what that means is that if you assign permissions to a group that contains another group, there could be lots of levels of permissions being applied to objects. It gives us a very high level of granularity, which is great, and control, which is great. So we can do a lot of interesting things, but it also makes it really confusing. So typically, it's best to try to keep just one level of nesting or less in your groups, which would look something like this. If you do any more nesting than this, then it can get rather confusing when you're troubleshooting access to objects because of this nesting of these groups and how permissions are applied. And you'll see in group policy that this can become very complicated when you have a lot of nesting with groups. So you can convert a group scope. So in other words, you can take a universal group and convert it to a domain local, or likewise universal to a global, and so forth and so on. So you convert these different types of groups back and forth, or these different scopes for groups. The default groups in a Windows domain, you have a built-in folder which has all of your built-in or default groups, such as local admin. You have a users group, which is a combination of domain, local, global, and the forest root domain and universal scope, and then specialty identity groups that can be assigned permissions by adding resources DACLs. In other words, there are some default groups that come with Windows Server that you can use, or you can create your own groups. And most of us find that we have to create our own users, or our own groups rather, based on what our organization's needs are. But I guess in theory you could use the ones that are built in. But you'll find that these are available to you when you create, when you start managing these groups, and you'll see these in the labs. So in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about how to work with computers. So you can also, just like we have user accounts and groups, a computer is another type of object that can be members of groups and be assigned to groups and so forth. So we'll talk about that in the next slide deck.